I still remember the way my hands were trembling when I closed the heavy wooden door of the notarius' office behind me. Just an hour earlier, I had walked in thinking I was there to sign a few formal papers related to my late grandmother's modest belongings. I expected an old sewing machine, some antique dishes, maybe a small savings account. Instead, I walked out carrying documents that would change everything: 3 apartments in the city center and a countryside house with land. My grandmother had always been a quiet woman. She never bragged, never complained, and never let anyone know how much she had sacrificed throughout her life. She lived in a simple 2-bedroom apartment, wore the same wool coat for 10 winters, and grew her own vegetables even when she could afford not to. To everyone else, she looked like a pensioner barely getting by. To me, she was warmth, wisdom, and unconditional love. When the notary calmly read the will and said my name as the sole heir, I thought I had misheard him. "All movable and immovable property shall be transferred to my granddaughter," he repeated, looking at me over his glasses. I felt as if the air had left the room. 3 apartments, 1 summer house, no mention of my mother, no mention of my uncle. Just me. On the way home, I wasn't thinking about money. I was thinking about responsibility. About my grandmother's trust. About why she chose me. I remembered all the weekends I had spent with her while others were too busy. I remembered bringing her groceries when my husband complained that I was wasting time. I remembered sitting by her hospital bed when the rest of the family only sent messages. By the time I reached our apartment, my mind was racing. My husband and his mother were in the kitchen when I walked in. My mother-in-law was stirring soup, as always, as if she owned the place. She had lived with us since our wedding, reminding me daily that I was lucky her son had chosen me. "You're late," she said without looking at me. I placed my bag on the table and took a deep breath. I went to the notary. My husband barely looked up from his phone. "And what did she leave?" His tone wasn't sad, it was curious, calculating. I sat down slowly. "Grandma left me 3 apartments in the country house." For a moment, there was silence. Then the spoon slipped from my mother-in-law's hand and clattered against the pot. "3 apartments," she repeated, turning around sharply. My husband stood up. "You're serious?" I nodded and placed the documents on the table. The official stamps glowed under the kitchen light. The atmosphere changed instantly. The same kitchen where I had been criticized for years suddenly felt like a negotiation room. My husband pulled out a chair and sat closer to me. My mother-in-law's voice softened unnaturally. "Well, that's wonderful news," she said, forcing a smile. "Family property should strengthen the family." Family. The word echoed in my head. For years, I had heard a different version of it. In this family, we do things my way. In this family, the daughter-in-law must respect elders. In this family, money decisions are made by the man. Now suddenly, it was our property. My husband picked up the documents and flipped through them quickly. "We should think about renting 2 apartments, he said immediately. "And maybe selling the house. We could invest." It had been less than 2 minutes. I watched them carefully. The excitement in their eyes wasn't for me. It wasn't about my grandmother's memory. It was about opportunity. Control. "I haven't decided what to do yet," I said calmly. My husband frowned slightly. "What do you mean?" "We need to plan." I replied, holding his gaze, "it's my inheritance." The room went cold. My mother-in-law cleared her throat. "Of course it's yours, dear. But you are married. What belongs to a wife belongs to her husband." I felt something inside me shift. For years, I had doubted myself. Wondered if I was too sensitive, too ambitious, too independent. But in that moment, I felt clarity. "My grandmother left it to me," I said quietly. "Not to us, not to you, to me." My husband's jaw tightened. "Are you saying you don't trust me?" Trust. Another word that had always been used like a weapon. "I'm saying," I answered, "that I want to honor her wishes." The conversation that followed revealed more than I expected. Suddenly, plans were made without asking me. Numbers were calculated. My role was assumed. That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept thinking about my grandmother's handwritten note attached to the will. The notary had handed it to me after the official reading. "My dear girl," it began, "I leave this to you not because you need money, but because you need freedom. Never let anyone convince you that your worth depends on what you tolerate." Freedom. I realized then that the apartments in the house weren't just property. They were protection, a safety net, a second chance. Over the next few days, my husband became unusually attentive. He brought flowers. suggested vacations, spoke about our future investments. My mother-in-law stopped criticizing my cooking. But kindness born from greed feels different. It has a temperature, a weight. One evening, my husband finally said what had been building up inside him. You know, he began carefully, it would be smarter to transfer at least one apartment into my name. For tax reasons. For tax reasons, I repeated. Yes, it's safer. Safer for whom? I looked at him and realized that the inheritance had done something unexpected. It had removed fear. For the first time in our marriage, I knew that if I needed to leave, I could. I wouldn't have to beg for shelter. I wouldn't have to start from zero. I spoke to a lawyer, I said calmly. His eyes widened, without telling me, yes, and the property remains legally mine unless I choose otherwise. The argument that followed was loud, emotional, and revealing. Words were said that couldn't be taken back. Accusations, threats disguised as advice. My mother-in-law called me ungrateful. Ungrateful. For what? Years of subtle humiliation. For being told I was replaceable. A week later, I made a decision. I moved into one of the inherited apartments. Alone. It wasn't dramatic. No screaming. No broken dishes. Just quiet determination. I packed my essentials, left the rest behind, and drove to the place my grandmother had once shown me proudly, saying, "One day, this will protect you." Standing in that empty living room, sunlight pouring through large windows, I felt something I hadn't felt in years, peace. My husband called constantly at first. Then he threatened divorce. Then he promised change. My mother-in-law left angry voice messages about shame and reputation. But something inside me had settled. I wasn't acting out of anger. I was acting out of respect, for my grandmother, and for myself. Over time, I renovated the apartment. I rented out the other two. The countryside house became my weekend escape. I planted flowers in her memory. I framed her photograph in the hallway. Financial independence brought emotional clarity. I realized how often I had minimized my needs to maintain peace. How often I had accepted less to avoid conflict. The inheritance didn't destroy my marriage. It revealed its foundation. Months later, when the divorce papers were finalized, I felt sadness, but not regret. I had lost a husband who loved control more than partnership. I had gained myself. Looking back, I understand my grandmother's wisdom. Wealth is not just about money. It's about options. It's about dignity. It's about the ability to choose respect over fear. If you're watching this and facing a similar crossroads, remember this. Sometimes life gives you an unexpected gift not to make you richer, but to make you braver. Property can be counted in square meters. Freedom cannot. And that day, walking out of the notary's office with trembling hands, I didn't just inherit 3 apartments in a country house. I inherited the courage to finally come home to myself. When I closed the door of my new apartment for the first time, the silence felt unfamiliar. Not heavy, not lonely, just quiet in a way I hadn't experienced in years. The space was empty except for a folding chair and 2 suitcases. My footsteps echoed against the bare walls. I stood in the center of the living room and slowly turned around, trying to absorb the reality of what I had done. I had walked away from a marriage that once defined my identity. I had chosen uncertainty over silent resentment. And for the first time in a long time, I wasn't afraid. The first week alone was not glamorous. There were no cinematic moments of dramatic freedom. There were utility bills to transfer, locks to change, internet to install. I met with a property manager to evaluate the other 2 apartments. Both needed cosmetic repairs, fresh paint, minor plumbing fixes, updated lighting. Nothing overwhelming, but enough to require decisions. Decisions that were mine. I began to understand something powerful. When you are the one signing the documents, approving the renovations, choosing the tenants, your voice changes. It becomes steadier, clearer. You don't look around for permission. My husband, soon-to-be ex-husband, cycled through predictable stages. First anger. He accused me of manipulation, of hiding money, of planning this escape for years. Then negotiation. He suggested we start over in one of the inherited apartments, as if relocation would magically fix years of imbalance. Finally, he turned to guilt. Marriage isn't about running away when things get hard, he said during one of our tense phone calls. I remember standing by the large window, watching the city lights below. No, I replied calmly. Marriage is about respect, and I've been negotiating for respect for years. He didn't have an answer to that. Meanwhile, my mother-in-law took a different approach. She began calling relatives, painting me as selfish and unstable. I heard through distant cousins that I had abandoned my husband for money. It stung at first. Reputations are fragile things in families that value appearance over truth. But something surprising happened. I stopped defending myself. There is a quiet power in not explaining your boundaries to people who benefited from your lack of them. 2 months into my new life, the first rental contract was signed. A young teacher moved into one apartment. A software engineer rented the second. The steady rental income created something even more valuable than financial security. It created breathing room. I didn't need to rush into decisions. I didn't need to panic about the future. I enrolled in a professional certification program I had postponed for years because it wasn't practical. I redesigned the countryside house slowly, turning it into a place of restoration instead of obligation. On weekends, I would drive there early in the morning, open all the windows, and let the fresh air carry away the lingering doubts in my mind. One Saturday, while cleaning out an old wooden cabinet in the country house, I found a small envelope hidden behind loose boards. Inside was another letter from my grandmother, written years earlier but never mailed. If you are reading this, it began, it means you finally understand what I could never say directly. Love should feel safe. If you ever feel smaller inside your own home, remember you can build another one. I sat on the wooden floor and cried, not out of sadness, but out of recognition. She had seen it. She had noticed the way I shrank during family gatherings. The way I spoke less when my husband interrupted. The way I defended him even when he dismissed me. She had known. The divorce process moved forward with surprising efficiency. My husband initially demanded a portion of the rental income, claiming moral contribution. But legally, the inheritance was protected. The lawyer handled it calmly. Facts are powerful when emotions run wild. What shocked me most was not his attempt to claim part of the property, it was how predictable it felt. As if the inheritance had simply accelerated an inevitable confrontation. During mediation, he asked one final question. So that's it, you're choosing apartments over marriage? I looked at him across the table and realized how differently we defined value. I'm choosing dignity, I answered. The final papers were signed on a gray Tuesday morning. There were no dramatic outbursts. Just signatures, dates, a final handshake that felt more like closing a business partnership than ending a love story. Walking out of the courthouse, I expected to feel devastated. Instead, I felt light. Not happy in a celebratory way, but aligned. The months that followed were transformative in quiet, practical ways. I learned how to negotiate service contracts. I learned about property tax planning. I met other women who managed their own assets. I started attending local investment seminars, not because I needed validation, but because I wanted knowledge. Knowledge replaces fear. One evening, while reviewing renovation invoices at my dining table, I realized something profound. I was no longer reacting. I was creating. My life was not shaped by someone else's mood or approval. It was shaped by my decisions. Of course, there were lonely nights. There were moments when I missed the idea of companionship. But I began to distinguish between missing a person and missing familiarity. They are not the same. I also began therapy, not because I was broken, but because I wanted to understand why I had tolerated imbalance for so long. The sessions were eye-opening. I recognized patterns of overcompensation. I saw how I had equated patience with virtue, silence with maturity. Healing is not dramatic. It is repetitive. It is choosing differently over and over again. 6 months after moving out, I hosted my first dinner in the new apartment. Close friends sat around the table. We laughed. We spoke openly. No one monitored the conversation. No one corrected my opinions. The energy felt equal. At the end of the evening, one friend pulled me aside. "You seem different," she said. "I am," I replied. Confidence had replaced defensiveness. Calm had replaced tension. The countryside house slowly transformed into my sanctuary. I planted lavender along the pathway. I restored the old wooden swing my grandmother used to sit on. I even created a small reading corner by the window where afternoon sunlight pooled gently across the floor. One afternoon, sitting there with a cup of tea, I thought about the version of me who had walked into the notary's office months earlier. She was nervous, uncertain, still trying to keep peace at all costs. If I could speak to her now, I would say, "You are allowed to outgrow what once felt permanent." The inheritance was never about wealth accumulation. It was about structural independence. It gave me leverage, not over others, but over my own fears. Interestingly, as my internal stability grew, external validation mattered less. Gossip faded. Relatives found new topics. My ex-husband eventually moved on. I heard he remarried quickly. I wished him well, genuinely. Resentment is heavy, and I no longer had space for unnecessary weight. Instead, I focused on expansion. I converted one apartment into a short-term rental to diversify income. I consulted with a financial advisor to optimize taxes. I began mentoring a younger colleague at work who struggled with self-assertion. I recognized in her the same hesitation I once carried. "Your voice deserves space," I told her during one of our coffee breaks. The most unexpected change was internal. I stopped apologizing for existing. I stopped softening my achievements to make others comfortable. I stopped confusing compromise with surrender. A year after the inheritance, I returned to the notary's office, not for legal reasons, but to draft my own will. The irony wasn't lost on me. The same place that marked the beginning of my independence now became a place of intention. I decided that if I ever had children, the properties would go to them with one condition attached in writing: education in financial literacy. If not, they would fund scholarships for women pursuing professional training. Wealth should empower, not control. On the anniversary of my grandmother's passing, I drove to the countryside house and spent the day in quiet reflection. I cleaned her framed photograph, refreshed the flowers outside, and sat on the restored swing. "I understand now," I whispered into the afternoon air. The wind moved gently through the trees, as if in response. My life wasn't perfect. No life is, but it was mine, structured by intention rather than obligation. If you are watching this and standing at your own crossroads, here is what I've learned: security is not the absence of risk. It is the presence of options. Independence is not isolation. It is the ability to choose partnership without fear. Sometimes, the greatest inheritance is not property. It is perspective. 3 apartments in a country house gave me financial stability. But what they truly unlocked was courage. The courage to evaluate love honestly, to demand reciprocity, to build an environment where my voice did not need to shrink. And as I look around the living room that once echoed with emptiness but now carries warmth, laughter, and quiet confidence, I know this. I did not walk away from something. I walked toward myself.